Welcome. Here's a student assignment and video clips on Gebusi women concerning their changes over time. Back in the 1980s, Gebusi women had a very separate life from Gebusi men. They had parallel lives but somewhat separate. Here's a picture of a woman by the women's section of the longhouse. Women stayed physically separate from men in their sleeping quarters in a small cramped space to the side of the main longhouse. And here's a woman in traditional dress with no covering on the upper half of her body and a traditional grass skirt going up to the women's section of the longhouse. Women at this point, and still the case now, are the primary carrying capacity of Gebusi society, including carrying of net bags of various forest produce and other things from the forest to the village and vice versa. Here's a Gebusi woman from the early days wearing 2 net bags on her back, plus her child, who himself is carrying a net bag with a bird egg wrapped in leaf on the top. So Gebusi men at this point were guarding somewhat against intruders or potential warriors, so that they would often go around with bows and arrows in the forest, whereas women would be doing the heavy work of lifting and carrying while the men were, in principle at least, protecting them. Here's a woman pounding sago pith with a stone adze in the forest, and the processing of sago starch by women was a very laborious task that they still do as part of the gendered division of labor in Gebusi society. And here's a woman who's been pounding the pith with a sapling stick, another very laborious part of effort to procure major starch dimension of Gebusi diet. Women also enjoyed their physical environment, and here's a young girl from the early days gathering a prawn from one of the streams, so casual foraging, trying to find whatever might be crawling or could be hunted with a stick or a club by women as well as men would be important. Men would have bows and arrows and would be hunting the larger game, but women would be opportunistically foraging as well as gardening, on many occasions going back and forth in the forest. Women were also primary in the mediation and transition of spirits from life into death. Here's a woman grieving the death of her husband, and is described in the Gebusi. Women are the primary agents and have been of mourning and facilitating transition of spiritual life from life to death in the same way they do from birth at the beginning of the life cycle. Here's a woman who, this is Fadine, whose male relative has recently died and has been buried underneath her. She's sitting on top of the grave, and you can see the cadaveric fluid from his corpse that she has, out of a sign of love and devotion, rubbed on the lower part of her body, on her legs. And even when offered soap, she didn't want to wash it off because of her sense of mournful and sorrowful identification with her deceased male relative. Gebusi women at this stage also were often prime suspects for sorcery accusation following the death of someone in the community. Here in the foreground is Sialim, who was accused for having magically killed her husband, who committed suicide, as a potential Ogawili accomplice. And just in back of her, another woman, Tosi, who was also later accused of sorcery for causing the death of a man in the settlement. And you can see the ambivalent physical postures of the girls in back. This is a public occasion, and they have a great sense of ambivalence and awkwardness about it as part of female presence at this occasion as well. Here is Tosi handing a piece of cooked divination sago to the brother of the man who had died, for whom she is accused as a sorceress, and in an attempt to establish her innocence, which is very difficult in these divinations, she has a very humble gesture of proffering food to the brother of the deceased. Now, Gebusi women at this stage also had a great deal of fun and enjoyment of ceremonial occasions. Here they're wearing clothes largely that were able to bring in during that early period, sitting on the men's section of the longhouse, one of the few occasions at which they would be accorded the ability to be in that public space, and with male dancers on the main part of the sleeping section floor. They're sitting on the side, joking and singing songs that accompany the male dancer. Gebusi women's attraction and sense of beauty and allure was very significant, both symbolically and ritually in the image of the red female bird of paradise, but also in real Gebusi women. This woman, whose name happened to be the same word as taboo, toim, men would say, "Oh, I can't look at this picture, she's too beautiful, and I'll be attracted to her." So a great sense of allure from beautiful women, but also a sense that during most daily life, women were not able or encouraged to use their physical charms or to flirt or act casually in a way which could elicit male attention. In fact, they could be significantly chastised or even beaten for attempting to flirt or have casual relations socially with unrelated men, much less having sexual congress with them. Now, some women, notwithstanding, took risk to have a greater sense of freedom in their social and even sexual lives. Here's a married woman who was caught in an adulterous relationship with a young man. This was taken at a different time before that, when she was more at ease. But following that event, she was beaten, as described in the book. And the man was chastised too, but not with the same intensity, physically or otherwise, that the woman, in the breach of etiquette and the illicit affair, had to endure. Now, Gebusi women really, in their own traditional way, enjoyed feasting and ceremonial life. You can see here at the climactic initiation ceremonies, which were largely for men, but to some degree, as we'll see, also for women. Dressed up, the women on the left and the right are painted red, as in red bird of paradise costumes, and this is very significant for the general demeanor and ambience of the occasion. And here is a female dancer on the left, dressed as a red bird of paradise, paralleling the male drummer to the right in climactic display. And you see in the background a Gebusi man with blue shorts is kind of flirting with a grinning smile with a woman who's posed against, in the red bird of paradise costume, standing against the sago thatched wall in the background. So you have kind of the social portrayal and playing out in real terms of the symbolic attraction and allure and eroticism of a very charged sense of physical and sexual attraction, and kind of a dance of courtship or a flirtatious union between the male and female dancers in the foreground. On most occasions, this would be very much prohibited, but some license was accorded more during these special ritual occasions. And again, women were more at risk of being chastised for any part in these kind of flirtatious encounters, much as they sometimes participated or wanted to participate in them, much more so than was a problem for men. In the climactic final lineup of initiates for the fertility initiation ceremonies, women were accorded status along with men. You see the two men on the right side, but two women on the left with equivalent costumes. Much of the ceremony revolved much more explicitly around the men in terms of pigs being killed in their honor, ceremonial garb being given to them in much greater numbers, and other rituals. But in this final display of male and female spiritual and sexual celebration of kind of effervescent vitality and energy among the group as a whole, that women as well as men were accorded kind of equivalent symbolic and ritual status. Now, moving forward 16 years, by 1998, things had changed an awful lot for the Gebusi. They had moved their settlement from Yibihilu, the part of Gebusi territory that I worked in, to Gasumi Corners, right near the main government airstrip. And as a result, women as well as men had much more access to the government activities and programs that would be associated with modernity or becoming more modern. And one of these was the market. So the twice-weekly market was very important for women, as described in the Gebusi book. They were over 90% of the sellers at the market were women. And here they're displaying their goods, tremendous piles of ripe, fresh forest produce. And even though they often didn't sell anywhere near as much as they would have liked to, and much of their effort was lost or not productive in terms of selling and gaining money, it was important socially for them to connect with other women and as an occasion to kind of participate in whatever way they could in a modern cash economy. And in the process, they were able to socialize with women from other settlements as well. Also at this period, by the late 1990s, school was very important. So the Gebusi were close enough to attend the government school on a regular basis. Here you see first graders learning arithmetic and numbers from teacher Jack Truman. And you can see the girls in the front row along with boys, fairly equal distribution in the first grades. Over time, the girls dropped out of their schooling education much more easily and in larger numbers than the boys, who sometimes continued on. But they did have some exposure. When I asked the children to draw pictures of what they might want to be in the future, the girls often drew themselves as being a nurse in the future, models that they had seen from women at the nurses at the Nomad Health Clinic, and sometimes also teachers. I want to be a lady teacher in the future. Here's a girl who envisages herself doing studying and working at a desk, kind of like she is copying in school, but as a professional, being able to teach other children. And here's another girl who drew a picture of herself as a school teacher watering flowers in the community garden. Now, in church as well, women were very important. They participated equally and even in greater numbers than men in most of the church services. They didn't have leadership roles so much in terms of leading the church or being lay pastors or taking other important roles as functionaries, but they did make up a preponderance of the congregation on many Sundays, and their inclusion in Christianity was very important to them and marked a significant difference, whereas women in the singing of traditional spirit seances, for instance, would have been excluded from the gatherings. Here they're a full participant and audience for spiritual life in a more modern context. Ceremonially speaking, by this point, Western clothes had come in as a very important dimension of female display in ceremonial life. You see the woman moose, who we'll see later on at an older life stage, here with a long nose plug as a more traditional costume element for women on the right, but certainly the dress and the beads and so on is very much modern. At this point, women would be very ashamed and embarrassed to be seen without clothes on the upper half of their body, and portraying themselves in a more modern way was very important ceremonially and for special occasions and feasts. Now here's a celebration at the Nomad Independence Day ceremony in September of 1998, and in a portrayal of traditional folklore, kind of re-representing their more ancestral customs, here's a tribal group for which the woman is an equal partner on the left with the man on the right, holding the placard or sign that announces "Welcome to the Nomad Youth Show 1998" from their group in Deba Fall and across the Strickland River in Deba Pari. So showing some degree of gender symmetry and equivalence in the portrayal of tradition in a more modern folkloric context. In terms of gender relations for marriage and intimacy as well, things had changed somewhat for Gebusi women, but with a sense of tension also. These were the two women who were portrayed in, I believe it's chapter 10 of the Gebusi, as participating in a sister exchange. The two of them married brothers. Each of their brothers were exchanged as each other's husbands. And the woman on the left had a falling out with her new husband and would not stay with him, which led to great discord. So her attempt to exert her own agency against the strictures of sister exchange in this case was very troublesome for her and the community, and she was chastised and beaten, and she held her own ground and refused to be married to this man and got her way, but it was at the cost of great sense of tension. So the exertion of female agency in marriage at this point was accorded some significance and value, as it always had been, but also was subject to a lot of tension and ambivalence and difficulty sometimes as well. Now, some of the families in the late 1990s had started to establish what we might call a somewhat more companionate style of relationship between men and women. Here's my friend Keita on the left and his wife Benet on the right. And he's somewhat of a more modern man at this point. You see his wristwatch, and he is fluent in talk piecing and knows how to read and write a little bit. And he has a somewhat more modern style of marriage where he's able to relax and talk in a slightly more equivalent way with his wife. Traditionally, men and women wouldn't really easily pose together or be seen together as a married couple unless it was for a very functional reason, and they would much more typically be in the company of other men for the husband and other women for the wife, rather than sharing a more casual social interaction together, unless it was around something functional like sharing food around a family hearth at dinner time. Now, by 2008, the situation had changed. 10 years after the 1998 visit that I was able to make. At this point, the government office was largely closed. The airstrip was in very bad shape. Planes very seldomly landed. And many of the government services and the organizations and institutions associated with modern development that had been kind of piggybacked with government presence and money had dissipated and fallen into decline. And government presence in general was one of these casualties, as well as the closing or the great reduction of services at the Nomad patrol post or Nomad sub-district office station. And I was wondering what would happen to family life, because the church was in disrepair, the school was at this point closed, the market was very desultory. What would happen to Gebusi gender relations, given that these modern ways that the Gebusi women had more agency were now really cut back and much more vestigial or desultory in manifestation? And I was pleased and surprised to find that a number of families, including that of my great friend Ui here on the left, and his wife and some of his children, had a much more relaxed and casual family atmosphere that was becoming more typical among Gebusi as a whole than it had been in earlier eras. And this photo also is somewhat of a dedication to Ui, who has since passed away, my very good friend, to whom the third edition of the Gebusi book was dedicated. Now, by 2013, this pattern of family association had continued and intensified yet further. Here on the right is my very great friend since his early childhood, Sayu, who now is the father of 7 children, several of whom are here in this photograph. And he's in the family house along with his mother-in-law on the left, Tabwai, and the proximity between mother-in-law and son-in-law in a family house without a sleeping division between the men's and women's sleeping section, with a more undifferentiated use of gendered space and interaction, was really distinctive and increasingly important aspect of gender relations in the contemporary era as of 2013. And here's a shot in the same sequence of Dangsop, who is Sayu's wife, with 2 of her children, including in the foreground a brand new baby boy who was born while we were there among Gebusi in summer of 2013. And this is also very significant. Infants were in the old days considered to be very inimical to men. The birth blood and menstrual blood of women were considered to be very polluting for men, and men's agency and power of their social and spiritual and sexual essence was considered to be potentially very damaging to infants. And the fact that this new baby is in public view, is in a space where people are publicly interacting in a house shared between men and women, is a really striking difference from the early days of Gebusi, where the segregation of men and women, particularly for bodily functions such as menstruation or birth, or a baby wouldn't be anywhere near the presence of men for the first parts of its life, was very significant as a change and transformation in Gebusi society in reflecting gender relations in 2013. Now here is Moose, now a little bit more elderly in 2013, still an important carrying capacity dimension of Gebusi society, and now with children and even grandchildren of her own, which is very important, as shown in one of the video clips that you'll see. And the increase of root crops and various other introduced garden elements have increased the nutrition of Gebusi diet, and that, along with the stability of not having warfare and having more stable and casual social relations, has been very important for their population growth and the ability of children to live longer. So for a woman like her to have grandchildren was relatively rare in previous times during the 1980s and before, and now it's much more, happily, much more common. And here's a younger woman with 2 of her children. The number of children is really growing in Gebusi society, despite the fact they have very little in the way of organized health care or other things. There are some Catholic nuns who are nurses who perform inoculations and other vital services. So the number of children and the general health of society in terms of reproductive capacity is very strong and very nice to see among Gebusi society, especially given that they have plenty of land, and so there's not a pressure on resources for food production for them to support a growing population. And in contemporary times, the willingness of women to be seen and participate in a more natural way without necessarily wearing blouses or covering the top halves of their body is more and similar to the way things were perhaps in the early days, but with a greater sense of casual interaction in the mix. So that women certainly will cover themselves if they have the opportunity, but if it's not available or people arrive unexpectedly, it's not in any way as embarrassing as it was in the late 1990s. So one senses a kind of an easier shift of social relations that recuperate parts of an earlier ease of bodily comportment, but with more casual sense of being able to socialize across gender divisions, which were more problematic beforehand. Now, in terms of celebrating and letting down and having fun, Gebusi now are very much into disco dancing for special occasions. So here is Sayu and his friend Fonkai dancing in the foreground. And primarily men dance with men and girls dance with girls. But some of the girls do dance, and you see several of them in the background, including in back of Sayu, there's the woman in the blue shirt, and some of the younger girls as well. So that dancing includes girls and women as well as men, although still pretty much not with each other, mostly same-gendered dancing as opposed to cross-gendered dancing at this point in time. So the future of Gebusi gender relations and for Gebusi women is yet to be told. Significant changes that have happened. What is going to be the experience of a younger generation of women as they grow up? What changes will confront their society and culture, either economically and other ways, is an important and yet unwritten chapter in Gebusi gender relations. So to take stock now, we have Gebusi women in 2013, summarizing some of the changes over time that have taken place. Overall, there's been a reduction in what we might call gender polarization. The idea that women and men really should be separate, they should be segregated from each other in different ways. Women and men have always come together in some contexts, but that sense of division and the formality and the thickness of divide between men's and women's social worlds, although still there in important ways, is reduced relative to its previous manifestations. For instance, it seems to be easier for women and men to interact and converse between each other, both between strangers and also between husbands and wives and other kin to some degree. There isn't quite the sense of formality or that it's an affront for an unrelated man and woman to exchange casual words with each other. Certainly, it's important that women and men not be seen as being overly flirtatious or having innuendo of some sort of intimacy that's inappropriate between them. And adultery is very much frowned upon. Women wouldn't be seen on their own in relationship to strange men or men that they're not related to. But the ease of interaction is increased. And there's also more flexibility in living space vis-a-vis men for women. So the absence of a separate women's section, there are a few of the older longhouses that still have a women's section, but it seems to be much more vestigial, and there's much more casual interaction across the living space in an undifferentiated communal residence among women and men in family and domestic life. Casual female traveling is more prevalent and easier than before. And again, more in female groups, that women don't feel the sense that it's either tense or awkward or difficult for them to go about separate from men. And to some extent alone, although still it's inappropriate for women to be doing things alone that could court the attentions of men or a man who might come across him alone, outside of the settlement. But the reduction of warfare and the years and decades since raiding and the threat of great attack and killing by enemy groups has led to an easing of a sense of men don't need to travel with bows and arrows. They are a little bit more equal in carrying than they were before. So there's kind of a reduction of that sense of separation and real strong division between aggressive male warriorships and female activities as well, which is very important. And some of these things are symbolized in the reduction of what might be called beliefs in female pollution. Now, relative to some societies in the world and in the New Guinea highlands, beliefs of the damage that men and women might physically do by, quote, polluting each other with sexual or spiritual essences is much less than in some parts of New Guinea. But even among Gebusi, it was significant, as mentioned with the beliefs about infants not being in the presence of men, and the importance of women secluding themselves during their menstrual period. And these practices and beliefs have pretty much fallen out or become vestigial. And that's kind of symbolic of some of the easing of relationships between men and women in a number of different ways. Complementing some of the changes that have taken place for Gebusi gender relations over the years have been continuities in the life cycle of Gebusi women across time. First of these is a sense of relaxed childhood and upbringing. In the previous periods, childhood was relaxed but complemented by fear and threat of warfare or being attacked from other villages, which influenced adults and trickled down in terms of emotional relations with children. But if anything, the strong sense of nurturing support and casual, loving relationships with a mother, particularly for female child, has been a strong feature of Gebusi society and culture, and if anything, has expanded to the present day over the decades. Second is a sense of working and the productivity of work for Gebusi women. From a very young age, as soon as a girl can walk or carry things, she does so and is enjoined to do so by her mother and by other female relatives. She accompanies them to the garden, she accompanies them in sago processing and other expeditions, and she may be playing, but gradually she picks up and learns the value and the importance of producing and being productive in labor with other women in the community. And this is something that encodes a sense of value and importance for women that they keep with them. They really grows along with their own growing maturity over time. And women in their middle years are quite proud often of the work that they can do, the physical efforts that they can make, the support they have for other people. And it's seen as a positive thing that they can contribute starting in childhood, but continuing on through the life cycle. And this is something I think that also is important now, perhaps even more so because there isn't quite the sense of formal obligation or as deep a sense of formal obligation about gender role activities and productivity, but one that women to a significant degree take on as an important value and perhaps even more self-consciously chosen in the present as well. Now the teenage years, as for teenagers in many world areas, for girls often have a sense of approach and avoidance with men. They sometimes are intrigued or interested in the possibility of interacting with men. In the previous decades, this would have been much more hedged with formal relations and a sense of approbation or stigma, or being morally loose if women were too flirtatious with men, especially if it was an inappropriate context. And this divide seems to have softened, but it still is there to some degree. The awkwardness of women sometimes in the company of men in casual social relations, although, as mentioned, the divide seems to have has softened. Now, marriage among Gebusi women has tended to be fairly early for quite a long period of time. Often in the mid to late teens, after they reach physical maturity, Gebusi women will marry. Sometimes they will be enjoined to marry, but they typically have a strong veto power and a willing sense of desiring to be married themselves. And this is a pattern which has continued from the earlier days to the present, with marriage being relatively early in the life cycle. Usually by the late teens or early 20s, most women are married. To some degree, it's their choice, and they can wait sometimes a little longer if they so choose. Now, the options for Gebusi women are to marry within the community, and this maintains their ties of connection with whatever female and male natal relatives they have. If they have brothers and sisters who are also living in the community, if a mother or father are still alive, and other cousins from within their lineage or clan would be more likely to be co-resident within their community. And the majority of Gebusi marriages do take place within the community, or as we say, they're community endogamous, that is, marrying within the community. But on the other hand, sometimes women, either from a love match because they want to be with a man who comes from a different settlement, or there's a kinship match that she agrees to that transfers her physically to the residence of her husband. If the husband is from outside the community, she in most cases would move to live with his relatives. And in some cases, that means she would have less exposure to her own natal relatives, brothers, sisters, mother, father, and cousins, and so on, and would establish more of a new social world in the community of her residence, with the husband being patrilocal in residence, as residing on the male side. Now, in terms of motherhood, Gebusi women usually will attain motherhood as soon as they're physically able after becoming married. Often they'll have their first child within a year or two by their early 20s. And some women are able to bear quite a number of children and are proud to do so. The positive value of fertility and of bearing a number of children, if possible, is strong. It's always been strong among Gebusi, but this has been the ability to bear surviving children has increased, partly because better nutrition from root crops and a greater variety of food, partly because the reduction of dislocation or threat of violence that disrupts social life and makes it more tenuous, and partly also with a little bit of better health care, inoculations for infants particularly, the survivability of children seems to be greater, which allows women to have a larger families, and in some cases not just children but grandchildren to survive to adulthood as well. So the growing sense of being a woman at the center of a large, important family, working hard, having an array of kinship relations which link her through marriage and through other kinship connections remains very important within communities. And then finally, a woman's attaining of senior womanhood or moving on toward old age. She, in this case, is more dependent on others as her physical vitality and energy wane. However, the stigma or the onus of that seems to be a little bit less now than it was in previous decades. In the early days, the plight of widows was often quite sad, especially if they did not have any surviving children or close male relatives. They might be left fairly much on their own in a tiny home to fend for themselves and would be alone and would be more likely to have illness and die without a great support from other people. Now, with larger families, this issue is somewhat less reduced, although if a woman is widowed without children or without many relatives, she may have a fairly lonely end of her life cycle. So in all, we have some significant continuities in the Gebusi life cycle across childhood, growing up, teenage years, marriage, motherhood, and senior womanhood, and moving toward old age. In various ways, you see consistent pattern of some change in each of these categories due to the development of the reduction of gender polarization and the social and physical conditions that have facilitated that as well. So continuity with some degree of change has been very important for Gebusi women over time. Now we'll have some food for thought and student writing possibilities concerning changes among Gebusi women. And in particular, you'll view 3 different video clips of Gebusi women taken in 2013, and then answer the following questions. First, what's illustrated or described concerning changes in Gebusi women's experience as of 2013? What is depicted in the different video clips, and how are the changes that we described reflected or illustrated in important ways? Second, what is women's demeanor while on camera? What does their physical posture, their interactional style reveal or indicate or symbolize in relationship to the interviewer or the interlocutor, namely me, and other people in the film clip insofar as that's relevant? So how does this differ and what does it reveal? Each of the film clips has a different cast to it. It's a little bit of a different context, and you see different sides of women's demeanor. And how would you compare and contrast them in this regard? Third, what challenges remain for me, for Bruce, working with Gebusi women? In my writings, I've discussed the difficulty of working with Gebusi women in different ways. Those challenges are reduced in some degree with the reduction of gender polarization generally, but they still remain, which leads to a question of what can or could I do differently, including in the making of these videos themselves. What means of representing my relationship with Gebusi women is most and least appropriate, and what ways can this be viewed as a positive instance for reflection and thinking about both changing gender relations, the changing relations of the ethnographer with Gebusi women, and also the changing ways that we may represent that relationship, including in video clips as well as in writing. And then finally, how could a female researcher connect more fully with Gebusi women? I have certain constraints as a male researcher. What do you think, or what would you project as a female researcher you would be able to do differently? What kinds of things would you pursue that might be more difficult for a male researcher? What strategies or techniques of association and establishing firmer social relations with Gebusi women would be possible? And exactly how could a female researcher go about doing this? So these are 4 questions which we'll repose after the video clips, and you can take your best guess and possibility at addressing these in your own assignment.
Okay, here we are with abo ke masugua sink America nia ke Arawa ke English ton e dawa ke Gebusi ton. So here are village women. This is Moose, who was who was in Yibilu way back when, and he now has her grandchild with her, and also the wife of my Fesana, Ui, who also has her daughter right here to the left with her grandchild. And then we have the wife of the landowner of the Sonoi clan, Bubiai, who is in the forest with us, who's now my GPS. And so they're all here together in the house that Moose's son has built, and it's going to be one of the main places we may have a dance tonight. So these are all the women of the village who are associated with this particular house, hanging out the morning of the feast. Ka'ani alum, ke nobo, ke mogab, ke funkaiwi, ke nobo, ke yibihu dabma, ke wan agoma, eape wan agob, ke sam, ke hene, ke ma fesina, abui ehon eape hon ke ebo higi de bosam ke ma ke hene ke ma GPS ke debu dama e homohi e osubi agoma ke emsop ke higi eape won e suskap de bosam enia ke hutim ke os gogop ke awali de bois ke honui. So I see they're all associated with different men from different clans, and so women here are now all getting together and gathering for a kind of just a pleasant, relaxed time the day of the feast. And you can see behind some of the, dimly at least, some of the piles of food that we have getting ready for the feast. And this may well be the site, this longhouse, of a dance tonight. So here's a domestic scene with women and children, really easily talking with me, very casual, friendly. Significant difference, actually, from before, when it was much harder to talk with women. Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. Uh-huh.
Okay. Ke bubiai.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
In this clip, I'm talking with my good friend Kata on the left, but my real goal is to engage the woman on the right, Dalao, a young married woman, in conversation about her kids, her life, how much she sees her relatives, and things of that nature. Kata starts by designating which of the children there are the child of which adults, and then makes a mistake that Dalao corrects, and I try to engage her in conversation, but you can see how difficult it is with respect to Kata's well-meaning but ultimately intrusive participation. This is your this is Sayo's child. She corrects. No, it's actually my child, and that's her child as well. So I said, these two are her child, Keita says. So I said, wow. So I asked, what clan are you from? Asking her. And he answers, oh, the Kenkei clan. I say, I was at Yahibi, the Kenkei village, just a couple of days ago, and I saw the senior man, Tomoe, who I think is your grandfather, isn't he? She's all excited. Yes. Yeah, you saw my grandfather, Tomoe, in the Yahibi village. And Keita corrects, it's actually it's actually Tomoe's elder sister's child's child. That's her. So I try to find out how long it's been since she's visited her natal relatives back in Yahibi. Has it been a long time since you've been back to Yahibi? How many months has it been that you've been back and seen your relatives in Yahibi? Keita answers, oh, people don't really know. And she lives here now. She doesn't live back in Yahibi. Keita says, well, your Sigahal Tomoe, he actually gave her in marriage to this village. So I persist. Oh, no, I'm not asking that. I'm trying to find out how long it's been since you've been back to your natal village, just to visit back in your natal village. So Keita repeats what I'm saying. She says, yes, it's been a long time since I've been back to see my relatives. So I persist. How many months? How many months has it been since you're back to Yahibi to see your relatives? Long time. So I say, are there other people from your clan who are here in Gesumi Corners from the Kenkei clan? And Keita says, only one man. But I said, well, in my mind, I know that there are several others. So I say, oh, what about Mara? Oh, Mara. He was a good friend of mine. He's dead now. So, and I knew her father, who's a spirit medium. So I'm saying her father's name is Ubale. She's amazed that I know her father's name, and I know he was a spirit medium because she was so young when I was here. Oh, Famda, very sorry for her deceased father. And your mother is still living? Yes, your mother is still living. So I say, is her name Oyom? I remember that. Oh, she's interested. So that means your mother's brother has to be Sornoi. So I'm asking what her mother's clan side is like and what male relatives on the mother's brother's side she has. Okay, early in the trip we talked about the divide between men and women and how separate their lives are. But one of the things that I've really been interested and impressed by is that there's a softening of the division between men and women here. They don't live in separate parts of the house anymore. The young girls, some of them have been to school. Both of these girls have been to school. They're shy on camera, but we have been able to make more contact with them. It's hard to get it on footage, but it would be really interesting to find their lives in connection. They spend time in gardens, have kids really early, but they seem really happy in general and enjoy kind of the life they have. They enjoy men's joking. And it's a real opportunity. And even this scene could not have been taken 10 or 15 years ago. You couldn't get an adult man to sit down with two younger women. Even just to sit, even to be in the same physical space would be really impossible. So, although it's going to be hard to really talk with them and go back and forth, I just want to really make sure that we have, as a record, the younger women and the changes in their lives, which continue their life in the forest, but also talk pidgin gami hitaweda. Yeah. So she's saying, yeah, she understands a little bit of talk pidgin. No gami hitaweda. So it's still a little awkward, but they're real pleasant. They're real pleasant young women, and you can joke casually, talk casually between men and women in a way which is really impossible before. So there's an opening up of gender relations in a really interesting way, and something that could be documented more. And with the press of all things, we haven't done as much of that as we'd like to. But it's a really important thing. It's really important to make sure that the women's side of life here is really rich and important, and it's separate from men, but
It's subordinate in some ways, but in many ways, there's a sense of acceptance and equality at the same time. So it's an ambivalent relationship of women do a lot more of the work than men do in some ways. They carry things, they bear the children, they do more of the garden work after the men have done some of the initial heavy work. But they get along, and I get the sense that many marriages are good, people are happy together, and it's not quite as thickly divided, perhaps, as it was before. So to be continued later, but an important start in terms of Gebusi gender relations.